Hey guys, Future Greg here from the Editing Suite. Quick note before we dive into the full season recap of Alien Earth. A few of these episodes were recapped with some sarcasm, tongue-in-cheek jokes and some ad-libbing, and while it did land with some people, for others it really didn't, and I can completely understand that. If you're after a purely straightforward recap, just as a heads up, the tone here has a bit of fun sprinkled in that might not be to everyone's taste. And if that's not your thing, that's all good. There are plenty of other recaps out there, and there's some really good ones across YouTube too. But if you're up for a mix of detail and a bit of personality and sarky jokes, you're in the right place. So with that out the way, let's dive in. Episode 1 of Alien Earth begins with us on board the USCSS Maginot, which is part of the Weyland-Yutani Corporation. The year is 2120 and this current mission has been ongoing for 65 years. The Maginot is a deep research vessel and has been collecting specimens for a good while now, both dead and alive. They're still 805 million miles out from Earth, just roughly about 4 months away, but the crew awakens from their cryosleep to serve as exposition devices to explain the state of the world. There are 4 companies, but the new kids on the block, Prodigy, aim to change the established order of power. All of these guys are vying for power and control on Earth. Beyond that, Dynamic, one of the companies, controls the moon, while Yutani controls Mars and Saturn. The Maginot is carrying some pretty nasty specimens that we've become familiar with now. There are facehuggers, alien eggs, space slugs, and more. One of the engineers suggests they just shoot the specimens and be done with it, but Morrow, a synth, is quick to point out that's out of the question, given the core part of their mission are these very specimens. On Earth though, we get a closer look at Prodigy. They have their own research island, dubbed Neverland, off from the mainland. Boy Cavalier is the one who's running things here, who happens to be a trillionaire who's in the business of simps and cloning. His latest experiment involves moving the brain of a sick girl called Marcy into the body of a synthetic dubbed Wendy. The operation appears to be a success and a new human/synth hybrid is born. Marcy is still adjusting to her adult synthetic body though, but she can fall from great heights without injury, run super fast and continues to learn more every day. The engineers here explain that they've tried to simulate adolescence as Wendy grows into this adult synth body, so it's not so much of a culture shock, but the reality is she's not going to feel any real emotions and won't age like everybody else. At least that's what they think. Wendy isn't alone here though, as there are other children arriving on Neverland ready to transition. The company want Wendy to serve as the big sister for these guys and guide the kids on their journey to immortality. According to Cavalier, he's chosen children specifically because they're the perfect vessel for this journey. Their minds are way more elastic than adults and they're still growing, uttering that adult minds are too stiff. Back on board the Maginot, alarms wail across the ship. It's clear that the specimens have broken loose, shock, and the crew are being slaughtered left and right. One of the simps we saw earlier, Morrow, sends a report back to Earth about the breakout before hiding out from the xenomorph. A collision with Earth is imminent, and with a xenomorph on the loose, that's not good news for us. Whether Morrow orchestrated the specimens to break out or exactly how this occurred is still unclear given we've cut forward in time, but he does sacrifice the other crew members to the alien all the same. Over in New Siam, Prodigy City, Wendy has become obsessed with a guy called Joe. He works with Prodigy as a first responder and she watches him on the monitors. The reason for this fascination stems from the past. Now Joe is actually Marcy's brother from back in the day, and after the synth process, Prodigy told him that Marcy died. However, Wendy is still very fond of her brother, and given she still has her child brain inside this adult synth body, her idolization of her brother continues to influence her personality. However, everybody here is thrown straight into panic when the Maginot crash lands in the heart of the city. Among the first responders, who will go in with guns and weaponry, is Joe. The group immediately head to the crash site and look for survivors. On board the ship, they find bodies all over the place, but one that has managed to survive here is Morrow. He immediately speaks to Mother, the AI on board this ship, to alert Weyland HQ that they've been boarded. He's heading for the armory and intends to wait for backup. However, he soon comes across a couple of first responders, Hoyt and Anant, in the lab. There's a pretty grim scene of a creature slithering into the suit of one of the men, but Morrow doesn't see this. In fact, he holds them up at gunpoint, forcing them to drop their weapons and tying them to one of the pipes. Unfortunately, this bug attacks while they're incapable of moving and kills them both. The other group include Rashidi, Siberian and Joe, whose nickname is Hermit, and they find the cryo chamber and evidence of a chest burster. They don't see the facehugger in an adjacent chamber though and head off to investigate further. While Wendy is in the middle of various tests, she notices footage playing of Joe heading to the crash site and heads in to see Boy Cavalier. Despite the simp still being in the prototype phase and Atomine's being completely against this, Cavalier decides to entertain Wendy's idea and sends her and the Lost Boys into the crash site. Wendy is determined to save her brother no matter what, which is where episode 1 comes to an end. Episode 2 of Alien Earth begins with Joe, Siberian and Rashidi heading deeper into the ship. They come across a medbay with evidence of crew members dying from suffocation. There's further evidence of chest bursters too, and while Siberian is quick to move them along, Joe knows this is bad news. Specifically because it means the foreign bodies they were infected with means the possibility of aliens. The group press ahead all the same though, descending the stairwells until a xenomorph attacks. Joe manages to evade the xenomorph, scrambling for an elevator where he hides out, but in the process he ends up separated from Rashidi and Siberian. This couldn't have come at a worse time, as Joe, a day earlier, actually wanted to quit his job. Flashbacks flesh out more of this as Wendy watches her brother and somehow manages to rewrite the code on the bot he's speaking to, given she's watching him while Cavalier and the others are watching her, but it's not explained how she managed to do this, and unfortunately this hack doesn't stick. Joe's request to leave is also denied. On Neverland, Dame Sylvia listens to the different children give testimonies about their dreams and desires for the future on her computer. She sees their achievements as ending death, and now she wants to make things better and improve their quality of life. Cavalier though has a different way of thinking. His whole motivation here has been to talk to somebody smarter than he is and, specifically, armed with wisdom. Cavalier wants to debate with someone that will blow his mind, and he's hoping that Wendy will scratch that itch. Now Wendy and the Lost Boys touch down and most of the group head aboard and investigate the ship. Smee and the others find that horrific space bug from episode 1 in the lab, along with a strange eyeball with tentacles. This is species 64 and it's not particularly pleasant. They manage to capture it under a metal container, but it's definitely touch and go for a while. Elsewhere, Wendy and Slightly, another child synth, go on ahead to extract Joe. All the while, Wendy keeps hearing a strange buzzing sound in her ears. Now Yutani CEO speaks to Cavalier in the midst of this and wants to bring in a team to extract their specimen. Predictably, Cavalier is not budging and he plays hardball, deciding to get their lawyers involved. He wants what's on the ship for himself, and he watches the simps intently as they explore. Joe eventually finds himself right in the middle of a xenomorph massacre as it follows our titular character out the elevator into a big party with a bunch of rich people. The xenomorph obliterates everybody, and Joe is the only survivor. Thankfully, his plot armor prevents the xenomorph from killing him outright. Surprisingly, it's Morrow who manages to catch up to the alien first, and he shocks it into submission. He does the same to Joe though, before shooting the xenomorph with a strange gel that causes a cocoon to grow around it. At the elevator shaft, more soldiers arrive and hold Morrow up at gunpoint. This allows the xenomorph to burst free and massacre everybody, except Morrow. The xenomorph and Morrow are gone by the time Slightly and Wendy arrive, and they follow the blood inside, where they find Joe is awakened and is currently reminiscing over baseball.
Are you stupid or something?
Until Wendy shows. They convince Joe to go with them, and he tags along for the time being as they make it back on the ship. When he learns that Marcy has been put inside this synth body, Wendy, Joe wrestles with the truth and eventually believes her when Wendy remembers core memories that only Marcy would have had. Back in the lab, Kirsch connects to the commuter and learns more about this research vessel. He notices a holding area with eggs on the monitor and sends poor Smee down alone to investigate. However, he also messages for Wendy to head to the front of the ship to secure the cargo with Smee too. The group do just that and head to the front of the ship, where they find various alien eggs on the ground. However, the xenomorph returns and grabs Joe and throws him off the edge of the ship to the depths, prompting Wendy to rush after him, which is where episode 2 comes to an end. Episode 3 of Alien Earth begins with Wendy rushing down alone to save Joe from the xenomorph. While this is going on, Kirsch and his group begin containing the specimens and piecing together exactly what happened. For now, they suss that the crew lost control, but not much else other than that. Now, one of the crew members we haven't seen much of yet, Nibs, wonders why they're all called the Lost Boys, given half of them are actually girls. She's also not happy that Wendy gets to be Wendy, but the others riff on their own names too. Curly joins in here, but they're interrupted by Kirsch getting a call from Boy Cavalier. He confirms that this is no longer a rescue mission, but instead he wants the children to collect and contain the 5 species and bring them to the quarantine lab they have in the sublevels on Prodigy. As for Wendy, she finds Joe alive and kicking with a couple of cuts. He's stuck to the wall in some sort of alien glue, but this is all a trap by the xenomorph. It shows up but doesn't attack them, I guess realizing that these are the main characters, and eventually jumps onto the roof of this trailer, deciding to attack this way instead. Now Wendy pierces it with a sword, but it bleeds acid through the floor. However, it then stabs Joe through the heart and throws him across the floor. Wendy saves her brother though, fighting with the xenomorph by hooking its mouth before the pair work together and trap it in a hangar bay. However, the xenomorph throws Wendy in with it. Joe meanwhile opens a control box and bites the wires, hot-wiring the door so it reopens again. He needn't have bothered though, given Wendy manages to kill the xenomorph, decapitating the alien with a knife and leaving it an acidic mess. As Wendy passes out due to a dribble of her own blood, Joe does the same, but given he was stabbed in the the gut, his injuries are far more severe. Now Morrow soon shows up at the front of the ship where he finds the alien eggs. Now Smee and Slightly are messing about here and are caught off guard when they see him. Morrow doesn't tie them up though, but they watch as Morrow transfers the data from the bay into his head. He knows they're synthetic and asks Slightly when is a machine not a machine. It seems to affect him so, but Slightly tries not to let on that he's rattled. Kirsch soon shows up though and takes control of the situation, but when one of the eggs opens, Morrow decides to jump off the ship rather than being captured by Prodigy. We then jump forward in time. Prodigy contain the crash site, take the specimens with them and bundle both Joe and Wendy on stretchers to Neverland. Siberian and Rashidi are here too, having regrouped with the others after evading the xenomorph off screen, despite being quite near the creature last week. Anyway, Cavalier is delighted with the bounty that he's got and preps for more experiments to be done, while the scientists work on fixing up Wendy as well. Now Kirsch warns Cavalier from getting too close to the xenomorph egg when he wanders down to the lab, explaining how the facehuggers work and how the xenos spread. The only item that hasn't been accounted for here is Morrow, who's off wandering around New Siam. Now Morrow rings Yutani here and updates the CEO on exactly what's happening. He has the data for the specimens, hence why he transferred that information from the bay, but despite being told to come home, Morrow does no such thing. The only prime directive he has right now stems from bringing these specimens back, and that's precisely what he intends to do. Elsewhere, Curly arrives to see Boy Cavalier. He admits that Wendy is his favourite, but Curly tries to make a case that she should be instead. Given Wendy only cares about her brother, Curly has ideas for how to make the world a better place. Cavalier pauses on this and decides to give her some books to read, believing that she's in the race for being one of his favourites. Meanwhile, Morrow manages to hack into Slightly's brain and manipulates him into agreeing to work together, under the pretense of being friends. Now back at Prodigy, Wendy awakens and heads for the lab. However, Kirsch is currently there working on the alien egg. As he slices it open and takes the facehugger out, Wendy clutches her head in pain, seemingly able to hear the sound waves from these creatures. And Wendy eventually heads into the lab itself, clutching her head, before eventually passing out. And notably, it's quite amusing because no one actually sees her come in or that she's passed out, and we leave her just lying on the ground. Kirsch though is way too preoccupied with his experiment as he drops part of the alien from the facehugger, a tiny tadpole no less, into a large tank sporting Joe's severed lung. It doesn't take long for this tadpole to find a new home as a dribble of blood infects the water as a xenomorph takes shape. Episode 4 of Alien Earth begins with Wendy waking up to find Kirsch and the others looking over her. Her hearing has been taken offline for the time being, as Kirsch explains to the scientists here that the closer she gets to the xenomorph, the louder the frequency seems to get. Boy Cavalier shows up and organises traffic, deciding to bring her hearing back online, while Mr. Plot Armor himself, Joe, is still alive. He has a new lung implanted and is shocked to learn that there are deadly creatures in the lab. The engineers work to change Wendy's frequency before she recaps what we saw at the end of the last episode. Wendy doesn't want to go numb to the alien language though, believing they've picked her for this. Curly is fiddling with buttons in the lab and watches on enviously as Wendy broadcasts the alien's language through her own mouth. The chitters and chirps excite Boy Cavalier, who wants to do more tests, but Joe is worried about her well-being. Eventually Cavalier concedes and lets them go, but the billionaire reminds Atomind that these people, especially Plot Armor Joe, are living in his world, not the other way round. Alone, Joe explains to Wendy that he's mad at Prodigy for hiding what happened to his sister and keeping her existence from him. For now though, he promises to be here for her, but he has quite the grudge against Prodigy. Of course, it wouldn't be a Noah Hawley show without some trippy visuals and montages, and in doing so, this allows us to cut across to Morrow, who's still the best character in this show, and Slightly. Morrow continues to manipulate his new friend, telling him to get an egg. They communicate telepathically again, where Morrow uses the logic of morals to get through to the kid. Morrow also manages to extract Slightly's real name, which happens to be Arash Singh. This gives him a lot of leverage over the guy, and rife blackmail material should this simp fail to comply. For now though, Slightly heads on inside and attempts to get the egg from Morrow, and he soon realises it's not going to be easy. But then, given we did see Wendy manage to head into the lab alone and pass out while nobody bat an eyelid last episode, maybe it's not quite so difficult? Still, in the lab, the experiments continue with the eyeball monster using a sheep as a host. Boy Cavalier watches this controlled experiment with fascination as it burrows into its eye and takes control. Cavalier and Kirsch are intrigued to learn the monster is highly intelligent, changing brainwaves and standing perfectly still, which is pretty ominous and quite eerie, watching each of them in turn. Elsewhere, Arthur takes his wife, Dame Sylvia, outside and explains his concerns regarding Cavalier and his synth children. He doesn't think what they're doing is actually science and still sees the children inside these robotic bodies. He wants to keep their protocols in place. Now Nib suddenly shows up and decides that she's pregnant though, so Sylvia takes her to her office and explains how babies are made, and then looks set to show her a diagram of an adult female body. Nibs is having none of it though, as it appears she's suffering from PTSD after her encounter with the eyeball creature on the ship. When she lashes out, Sylvia brings security in and decides she should be confined to her room and raises a level 3 event in the process. While this is going on, Joe is questioned by Atomind. He doesn't really have much of a choice but to comply, given Joe has a new lung courtesy of Prodigy, and he won't see Wendy again if he leaves the island, given she too is their property. Later that afternoon, Boy Cavalier brings Wendy in for a chat. She laments him for cutting open the xenomorph, forgetting that she herself defeated one of these aliens with a little knife last episode. Of course, this also meant cutting open the xenomorph and decapitating it with barely a scratch on her. As they talk, Cavalier uses Joe as leverage to force Wendy into working with him. He wants to find out exactly what these Xenos are saying and believes that she's the key to unlock that mystery. In exchange, Joe will be allowed to stay on the island. Now Morrow visits Slightly's mother in India and uses her to blackmail the synth into compliance. Instead of bringing the egg out, he decides Slightly should smuggle a human into the lab, allowing the facehugger to do its work. In the process, Morrow will then find him and bring the specimen out. Now, given an earlier chat from Kirsch to Slightly about loyalties and hearing no evil, it would appear that Kirsch knows about Slightly's connection with Morrow and is waiting for the right time to strike. As the episode closes out though, Kirsch watches as Wendy heads into the lab and finds the little baby Xeno creature break free from the lung. She reaches out to touch it and watches the creature in wonder as the episode comes to an ominous conclusion. Episode 5 of Alien Earth starts with us jumping back in time on board the Maginot and 17 days before it smashes into Earth. Morrow is awoken by one of the crew who informs that they've got a problem. The captain is dead and a facehugger has done its damage on the science officer, with the host all but dead. I mean, you obviously can't just cut these things off, and once they've latched on, you're already a goner. A fire has broken out too, but the reason for this stems from a saboteur. This has fried their navigation systems and the engine relays too. Morrow encourages the engineers to get to work fixing this, and it seems they must have had some effect, because the ship launching itself that fast at the Earth would do some serious damage, a lot more than the ship actually did anyway. With the captain dead, command falls to Zora Zaveri, whom he urges to do an inquiry over the sabotage. However, she's maybe not the best person to ask, given she's been involved in a fling with his science officer Bronsky. He thinks her judgment is compromised and reiterates that the most important thing here is getting the cargo back to Earth. The group then decide to put the science officer in cryosleep, convinced that this will save him. Newsflash, it won't. Morrow checks out the rest of the specimens they've captured, the location of the fire and what could have caused this. The CCTV footage does shed more light on this, as it shows a saboteur, but it's not initially clear who, given there's a blind spot. However, he does see Zaveri and Bronsky getting it on in the cargo hold in this footage too, and I mean, of all the time and places, really, among these alien specimens? As for Zaveri, she heads to the front of the ship to talk to Mother. They basically reiterate what Morrow has already told her, that this cargo is a top priority, and the crew are basically expendable. That night, somebody blows a hole in the side of the ship. Their fuel reserves are down to 8% now, and as Zaveri and Morrow discuss what to do with the engineers, an alarm rings out. There's been a cryopod quarantine breach, and as we soon see, Bronsky is dead and the facehugger has done its work. The xenomorph is loose now, prompting Morrow to arm up Clem and Zaveri to try and contain it with these electric zappers. Unfortunately, they have bigger fish to fry, given more species managed to break out in the lab, including the eyeball creature Ocelus, which smashes free from its container. Zaveri gathers the crew and updates them on what's happening, and she wants them to sweep the ship and get the xenomorph back, along with informing that they have a saboteur on board. Given they don't know who it is right now, all non-duty related movement is going to be suspended. Morris speaks up and chirps in here too, demanding duty rosters and activity logs within the hour. Unfortunately, within this meeting, one of the engineers winds up drinking a spiked water bottle, courtesy of a blood bug that escaped in the lab, spraying baby blood bugs into the bottle. These creatures work quickly, and the engineer winds up vomiting blood and passing out. As for Zaveri, she learns about the escaped eyeball with the careless science officer, and they decide to leave it for later, shutting the lab and walking away. While all this is happening, Morrow checks out the logs and notices an intriguing chat between Petrovich and Boy Cavalier. It would appear that Petrovich has been working with Cavalier all this time, pretending to be in cryosleep, but actually awake and kicking about. The science officer contains the engineer, and Zaveri gives a nod for them to operate on him. They can see that he's contaminated, but Morrow doesn't think this is a particular particularly good idea. None of them wear hazmat suits or protective gear either, and believe it's a simple case of ticks. Zafiri's indecisiveness here kills the science officer and Rahim, who are both shocked when the blood bugs kill them both from a spray of acid. And through all of this, Teng, the weird bald guy who many of us have probably thought is a synth, is also killed by the xenomorph while he's alone after being interrogated. Morrow has seen enough here and decides to take control of the ship for himself. Now Clem and Morrow come under fire from Petrovich when he shows up and begins firing on them. The pair take shelter in that contaminated lab from earlier, but it's too late. Clem is dead, and Morrow unknowingly lets Oculus out. It seems nobody bothered to communicate and let them know about this little guy, and to make matters worse, the blood bugs are also on the loose too. The xenomorph drops down right behind Zafiri in the corridor, but it doesn't attack right now. Instead, it lets her run away and decides to chase after the woman all the way over to the bridge. Interestingly, Oculus arrives and infects the remaining engineer, taking on a human host in the process. It fights with the xenomorph and manages to latch to its face long enough to distract the xeno and let Morrow speak to Mother. This catches us up to the moments in episode 1 where Morrow sacrifices Zafiri for the xenomorph and lets her and the entire crew die. He makes it into the impact room and the ship crash lands. We then cut across to Morrow visiting the Yutani CEO afterwards and promising to kill Boy Cavalier and get her specimens back too, which is where episode 5 comes to an end. Episode 6 of Alien Earth begins with us back in the present on Prodigy Island, with Wendy fascinated by the rapidly growing xenomorph. Kirsch is quick to reassure Joe that Wendy single-handedly took out an adult xeno with just a little knife, so she can pretty much handle herself. Kirsch is not too worried by what's happening right now, reminding Joe that Wendy is the future and she has a bright one ahead of her. He also belittles Joe's idea of taking her home so they can live like a family. Meanwhile, Dame Sylvia, Arthur and Atomind look over Nibs. The latter is not happy about Nibs' sudden outburst that she's pregnant and wants it fixed. Dame Sylvia is quick to remind him that she has trauma from her moments at the crash site, hence her outburst and erratic mood. Instead of the initial suggestion of therapy though, Atomind decides a full memory wipe is the best way to go. Arthur and Dame disagree here, but because of this, Arthur is fired for disobeying a direct order. As for Nibs, the memory wipe is successful. Joe speaks to Wendy in the hallway, expressing concerns about the xenomorph. Wendy though is nonchalant about the whole thing, and she's convinced that this xeno is actually one of the good ones. Wendy wants to continue her experiments with it, and tells Joe that she doesn't want to leave with him. Boy Cavalier shows up to see the CEO of Yutani next, with Barrister McAfee working as a moderator overseeing proceedings. He's been hired on behalf of the Five to try and facilitate this meeting and come to an agreement over what to do with this crashed ship, and the specimens on board of course. Cavalier peddles the story of a cover-up and then mentions the specimens themselves, forcing the CEO of Yutani to cave. She admits that the species on board were meant to be studied at an off-planet research facility, which is where they'll be transferred to once she gets them back. There's a bit of back and forth between them until they eventually agree to a $20 billion settlement, but Boy Cavalier has a trick up his sleeve. He mentions how there's currently a quarantine procedure in place and will be for another 6 weeks. Miss Yutani is seething and when the meeting is over, decides Morrow should press on with his plan. Now Morrow intends to destabilize the facility and cause outright chaos. He'll then swoop in and exfil the xeno and the specimens. Interestingly, Kirsch and Morrow wind up verbally skirmishing in the elevator afterwards, with Morrow promising to see the old toy soon. Back on the island, Slightly is jittery and worried about his saboteur plans and shows up to see Joe. Interestingly, this guy is actually sketching out an escape route, but that's easier said than done on an island surrounded by a mass of water. Now Slightly wants to take Joe into the lab, but his desperation comes off as a little too awkward and unnerving, so Joe goes on patrol with his buddies instead. He wanders through the thick trees, keeping a lookout as Joe talks about leaving once again. And no, he's not particularly subtle about it, as they flag up his concerns and tell him that they've got a good thing going on here. Back in the lab, Wendy appears to be understanding the alien language and starts to communicate, or at least mimic, the xenomorph sounds. As a rapidly evolving alien watches on. Now Ocelos also watches all of this unfold from its cage too, paying specific attention to Tootles when he enters the lab alone to feed them all. Naturally, Tootles is an absolute idiot here, and along with breaking the feeding compartment door, he's super jumpy when Ocelos bangs on the glass and gets himself locked in with one of the specimens. Now these happen to be large bugs that spray corrosive acid and eat metal. It burns the synth and eventually kills it, feeding off the robotic parts. Realising that Nibs has had her memory wiped, Wendy shows up to question Dame Sylvia. She stands by the memory wipe and points out that Nibs had corrupt data. Now Wendy questions the lab and facility, believing humanity is what's really wrong here rather than the aliens themselves. Now while packing up his gear, Joe shows up to see Arthur at the lab. He's surprised to see the guy has been fired given he cares about his work. Joe speaks plainly and asks if he's safe around murderous specimens that want to kill, reproduce and destroy everything.
Are you stupid or something?
Arthur plays a part, reassuring the guy while actually typing on his computer that he needs to take Wendy and get the hell out of there. He even drops off a boat code for good measure too, and removes the trackers on the simps. When Joe leaves, an error suddenly pops up on screen, confirming that Tootles' signal has been lost. Now Kirsch watches slightly as he heads into the lab with Arthur, and there they find him absolutely destroyed. He doesn't wear any protective gear or try to call for help though, and instead he unlocks the door himself to bring the simp out, leaving the door wide open in the process. This gives Slightly enough time to open the other lab doors and locking him in, leaving Arthur inside all alone with the creatures. The facehugger does its work, with Kirsch watching on from his tablet on the plane. Now interestingly, Kirsch doesn't actually tell Boy Cavalier what's happening, deciding to keep quiet instead. Slightly attempts to hide in a human-sized vent with Arthur, but it doesn't do much good. We cut once more to Oculus, which brings this episode to an ominous conclusion. Episode 7 of Alien Earth begins with Slightly shocked as the facehugger does its work. Slightly is back in his room now and Arthur stashed under his bed. Smee hears a commotion and heads inside, very shocked to see Arthur and the facehugger. Slightly brings Smee on board with a mission to bring him down to the beach. As they head out into the corridor, Kirsch goes to the lab, where he sees the flies corrode some of the electrical boxes and sets to work bringing soldiers in to clean up the mess, doing their best to contain the area. Boy Cavalier is shown the video footage of Tootles' death and realises Oculus is more intelligent than he initially thought. He forbids any of the hybrids from entering the lab from now on and becomes obsessed with Oculus, believing it should be moved for further analysis despite Atomine's concerns. Wendy rocks up to the lab and sees Tootles' dead body, shocked at the death. She doesn't quite understand here, given she's premium, but she intends to tell the others all the same. When the soldiers block her off from leaving, she communicates with the alien, which bangs its head against the glass. Cavalier is concerned but lets her go, needing to get to the other hybrids. However, their trackers have obviously been turned off. Now Wendy reunites with Joe here, who pleads with her to leave. She wants to bring the others on board, but Curly wants to stay. She promises not to tell, but it's a little too late for that. Wendy hacks the monitors and lets the xenomorph out. As they make their way through the island, they come across gravestones with their former human names on. Now Kirsch catches up with Slightly and Smee in the hallway here, giving them access to the elevator and encouraging them to hurry up. He knows about Slightly's chats with Morrow of course, and helps them escape. Outside there are numerous patrols and the facehugger eventually comes off Arthur's face. We all know what's coming of course, but like winding up a violent Jack-in-the-Box, every scene with Arthur from here onwards is a little tease as we wait for the inevitable chest bursting. Eventually it does burst out and a baby Xeno races off, leaving Slightly and Smee shocked as they rendezvous with Morrow. Now when Morrow learns what's happened, he heads out with his small team hunting to get it back. Meanwhile, Boy Cavalier has Oculus moved to his office, where he believes this creature is the key to his intelligence woes. He wants to move it into a human host after realising it understands human speech and recites 3 digits of pi. Now Cavalier's idea is to move the creature into a human with low IQ so they can properly test its smarts. Atomine's nods, agreeing to start a list. Out in the woods, Wendy and the others are suddenly surrounded by soldiers. The xenomorph jumps down and attacks, but Wendy, Nibs and Joe are all fine since Wendy can communicate with the creature. She reaches out and touches it before telling it to hide and follow. Joe grabs a gun from one of the soldiers and takes off, and as he does, the baby Xeno is captured, but not by Morrow. Kirsch blindsides Morrow and his small team, double-crossing them and showing that he was very much using Smee and Slightly as bait to lure the cyborg in. Now Morrow is captured while Smee and Slightly are grounded. Joe, Nibs and Wendy make it down to the dock where they find the boat waiting for them. However, a whole bunch of soldiers are also here, including Rashidi. Nibs is psychotic and attacks, before Joe eventually subdues her by electrocuting the hybrid. However, it's not before she winds up with several gunshots for her troubles. Now Wendy is shocked and has the xenomorph lying in wait as the soldiers stand and watch them. Wendy is angry and looks like she could order the Xeno to attack, but before she pulls the trigger, the episode comes to an end. Episode 8 of Alien Earth begins with the xenomorph wandering through the forest. It doesn't eat some crabs, but does make good on the soldiers dotted around the island. Among those is Dame Sylvia, who heads to the gravesite to pay her respect to the children. However, she doesn't bank on the xenomorph sneaking up on her. Soldiers show and manage to shoot it though, saving her life. The xenomorph is still alive despite this, but things on Prodigy Island are going from bad to worse. Yutani have cut off their communications via Morrow cutting the underwater trunk line and Yutani itself jamming their satellites. Non-essential personnel have been evacuated from the island though, while all the hybrids are being kept in the same containment cell together. They discuss the implications of being kids in adult bodies before Wendy suggests they should team up together and hit back against Prodigy. Atomize doesn't think grouping the kids up like this is a particularly good idea, as they're not sure how it will hold. He's also worried that they're understaffed, and all the while the Xenomorph is picking off soldiers left, right and centre out in the field. Boy Cavalier refuses to evacuate any more people though, but he might have to as Wendy forces his hand. Now Wendy decides to communicate with the Xenomorph from inside her cell and get herself out of this predicament. All the electronics are switched off immediately, and the Xenomorph can hear her from the woods, running back to HQ. Now back in containment, Morrow awakens in the same cell as Joe. Wendy watches him on the monitors, mad about him shooting nibs. Smee though reassures her that he's one of them, and with one man guarding Morrow and a metal can on his arm serving as a weapon, Morrow effortlessly pushes open the door, knocks out the guard, and sets out to continue his plan where he left off. Now while all this is going on, Kirsch is in the lab just obliviously doing some electronic work. Morrow waltzes in through the front door though, and the pair wind up fighting. It's not much of a fight though in truth, as Morrow manages to easily subdue Kirsch. However, when he shoots one of the glass cages, something bursts out. Kirsch chokes out Morrow and knocks him unconscious, somehow. Anyway, Cavalier heads down to see the hybrids and Wendy effortlessly opens the door with a snap of a finger. Cavalier discusses how he killed his own father at the age of 8 and took over the business for himself. He's always had daddy issues and clearly suffers from ADHD as well. Now unfortunately the single guard he's with isn't enough to stop all these hybrids, who easily dispatch him and then force Cavalier to run. They want to play a game of hide and seek here, as Wendy splits the group up to find the different characters and mediate what's happening. Now Smee and Slightly are tasked with heading to the lab, where they tie up Kirsch and knock out Morrow to make sure he's unconscious. And Nibs heads to see Dame Sylvia, while Wendy goes after Boy Cavalier. However, he has Atomize bring Joe to him, but it turns out to be a trap. You see, Oculus breaks out the sheep corpse and chases after Joe around the room. Of course, he's saved by Wendy at the last second before that can happen. Now Atomize shows up too, but Wendy manages to control the android's programming to stop him attacking. Apparently he's on the same network as the rest of the electronics on the island, so it's easy for her to hack in. Now the eyeball creature manages to slip away in the midst of all this chaos, heading right down to the beach where it takes control of Arthur's dead body. All the while, the Xenomorph manages to break into the facility and begins killing what's left of the soldiers. Wendy explains to Joe that she likes the Xenomorphs more than people because they're at least honest. Joe reminds Wendy that humans are food to it, but she's not a human and stuck in an in-between area where she's not sure on herself and doesn't really fit in. Alone, Boy Cavalier heads to his airship, but he's stalked by the Xenomorph, who eventually catches up. When a few other soldiers show too, the Xenomorph goes for them first and moves past Cavalier without killing him. Now Wendy and Joe show too, while Rashidi and the other soldiers head right to the lab and open the containment cells. Naturally, they're killed for their stupid efforts, while Curly is here too and knocks the remaining soldier out. And Yutani heads in with a bunch of soldiers ready to attack from the air, while Wendy has Dame Sylvia, Morrow, Boy Cavalier, Kirsch and Atomize all together inside the same containment cell. The Xenomorph is also here too, just hanging out like Spider-Man on the side. The camera then zooms into Wendy's face as she decides that from now on, they're going to rule over them, which is where season 1 of Alien Earth comes to an end. Thanks for watching, and do let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Smash a like or subscribe to the channel, your support is very much appreciated. I'm Greg Wheeler, and from all of us over here at The Review Geek, we'll see you on the next video.